Great. All right. Well, that means that Elijah, you're leading us, right, in all the last really in-depth, powerful parts of the Constitution. So why don't you go ahead and share what Article 4, right? That's where we're at to start with. You can go all the way through them if you want, and kind of give us an overview, or however you want to lead.
Yeah. I'll probably go with the overview way of explaining.
Okay.
In Article 4, we see it's kind of talks about like the way they like deal with criminals and things like that. And kind of through all the rest of the what was it? Like 4 that I read.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of seems like it's setting kind of where you can see through it the way and the main difference it makes through most different ways of ruling in history, even with the 4th article, how it talks about dealing with criminals and the difference between like how people used to deal with criminal, like just back in older times when they would either probably just execute someone or not. There wasn't really a civilized way of dealing with things like that. And then with the United States, there was more of a civilized way of dealing with those things, down to even just putting them in court and not just deciding what to do without any like real solution, or just kind of breaking it down. And then we see kind of a more corporate way of rulership and making laws and making decisions was more of a thing with more than just one person, but more people making those decisions for the whole of things. A lot of it was kind of hard to understand because I don't understand a lot of these words.
Mm-hmm.
But most of these kind of seem, in just going and explaining how things are to be done in each state, and how the United States provides rights for like each state and giving them kind of independence, because that's what a lot of America was about, is the choice to do things, but also the corporate decisions and not one head of rulership. And we see that that's why America became a very powerful country, because of how they chose to rule like that, and because how it was so different from the way the world had previously been under rulership. And that's why America kind of was able to prosper very well. And you can see through these amendments, or not, like articles that kind of explains how those things were done, and showing how those were carried out. But kind of seems like those things have fallen apart a little bit through, especially even today's time. Maybe too many rights were given in this time, and it kind of seemed to get more easy and easy through time has passed, because I guess once it started, maybe people started to open their minds up too far because they had already achieved making it independent, but I guess it went too far on that note. Anyways, a basic overview of these was just kind of the ways in which the United States was different from most ways of ruling, and the kind of the corporate rulership. So that's mostly what I took off of it, the 4 last articles.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? There is a lot of big words.
Yeah.
Understanding what they mean and putting it into context. And so again, yeah, good job, because you really encapsulated kind of, and the reason why I lumped those all together is they really have a lot to do with now the walking out part of the Constitution, where it's really setting us up to get into the amendments that will then, kind of undergird all of our basic rights, right? So kind of, as you pointed out, taking a step back to we the people again. And so we saw in the first 3 articles, right, we've established the president, the vice president, which is the executive branch. We've talked about the judiciary, which is the Supreme Courts and all of the courts underneath that. And then we also have the legislative branch, right, that's broken into the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so the first part of that really lays out for us the kind of central concept that we needed a strong central government, right? But the government was represented not by one ruling person, not a monarchy, not even the lords of the predecessors throughout history, right? We had kind of oligarchies, or people who monarchies, people who are rich, people who are well off. If you owned a lot of land, you would kind of be in control. Now, some of that trickled in a little bit, as we saw that people who were making these decisions were wealthy. They had properties and lands and things like that. But in their foresight, what they did was they limited that to be a representative government. And so at the heart of it always, we get back to that concept of we the people. And so yeah, let's take a look. We'll jump through the articles here real quick, because I'm eager to get onto talking a little bit about the Supreme Court justice, and maybe talking about some pros and cons, right? We discussed maybe having a little bit of a debate with that. And then as we push through this, the goal will then be to get into more of the real meat of some amendments and talking about that, which I think will be a little bit easier to open up kind of debate on different sides of things, because we have some pretty hotly contested thoughts on what rights we have, what rights are surrounding our speech, what rights surrounding possessing and owning guns and all of that stuff, and have 2 really clear lines in the sand as far as arguments are made. And so Article 4, yeah, you rightly said, you talked about just the different nature of crimes and criminals and what that looks like, and ultimately at the heart of what they're getting at here is the idea now of, we went from kind of a national government, overarching federal government, to now getting into states. One of the most important parts of our Constitution is that although we have a strong federal government, there is a lot of power that is given still to the states. And so this is the balance, right? We talked about it initially. There was no federal government that had any real power over the states. The states were in control, right, through the Articles of Confederation. It was an imperfect system. So the states had all of this control, which didn't help to bring unity, because different states have different priorities. And so as we see at the start of the Articles 1, 2, and 3, we've now established a stronger federal government. But these next articles will kind of lay out, we're not abandoning the states and the states' rights. And so when we see here in Article 4, Section 1, full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public, acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state, and the Congress may by general laws prescribe the manner in which such acts, records, and proceedings shall be proved, and the effect thereof. And that's a whole lot of what does that mean, right? It's a little confusing. And so kind of the idea now that we're getting into is if a state has a law or a rule or something structured around it, the other states have to honor that. And so what that means would be, and it's actually one of the areas where we see now from a modern understanding a weakness in the Constitution for the first time, because in fact we get down to this idea in section 2 where it says, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon the claim of party to whom such service or labor may be due. Now this had to do with a huge part of the slave trade. So we see that southern states predominantly owned slaves, used slaves as slave labor, and the north tended to be more free, generally speaking. And so what this meant would be, by law, if slaves escaped to the north, they would still be bound by their states in the south to be returned, providing that plantation owner or whatever could provide documentation that they in fact owned servants. And so now we have this kind of glaring weakness in our in the way we've structured things, correct? And so we have kind of the first kind of crisis at play here in the Constitution. Now there's a lot of different sides that are taken. There's a side that will look at this and say, see, America was built upon racism. Article 4, Section 2 proves this point when it talks about returning people who are in service. And so what we begin to see is kind of sowing some seeds for later problems down the road. Now, the framers were pretty divided. There were people who believed that slaves were not something to be held. In fact, there were pretty predominant slaveholders who didn't believe in the idea of slavery. And yet we see, again, some compromises or kind of kicking down the road, this idea of trying to resolve this issue. Because at that time in the world, we've got to understand that slavery was commonplace throughout every nation. And so that does not excuse it. But again, the whole kind of idea now around this is what happens in one state has to be protected. There has to be some semblance of law and rule, right? Because Texas is a different life, California is a different life than Washington. There's just different ways things are done, there's different groups of people, there's different constituencies. And so again, if we're going to have states that are represented by the people, the governments of each state will be vastly different. Again, where I grew up in Montana, when I grew up, there was less than 1 million people in the entire state. Montana's the 4th largest state. There were more people in Sacramento than there are in the entire state of Montana. And so those are radically different lifestyles. And so what we want to do, or what they wanted to do, is they wanted to make sure that states had some control and some power and some sovereignty over their own states, and that the other states would have to honor that. Now we keep going down to Section 3, and it talks about new states, that they may be admitted by Congress into this union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of another state. And so now we're laying out this idea again of not only are we trying to keep states powerful, but we understand that this may not be the end of things. It may not be the original 13 colonies. We might actually expand. There's got to be a way for us to determine how we manage those states. In fact, out of this section, we'll see later on historically, kind of trying to fight against that idea initially that if you were a servant in one area that you couldn't just escape and get away from it. They actually put into law that the idea of slavery would be, there would be a moratorium after a certain time. In fact, then we have the Missouri Compromise later on that will say if it's above this part of line, those will be free states, and if it's below, then they can be slave states, and then that was even outlawed. And so we even see now what's taking place, and it's really hard to see it unless you understand the whole of history, kind of this battle for basic human rights. And again, it's getting back to this idea of we the people. And it's important for us to understand it here, because this is going to begin to play itself out into when we get to the amendments. When we actually get to amendments, when we talk about freedom of press, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, and all of those things. What is happening is we're trying to make a basis on which the Supreme Court will decide. So it's pretty tricky within the verbiage. What we need to understand, kind of the broad strokes here as they will play out, is that states have rights. States' rights are extremely critical to the way that we founded the Constitution and the way that the Constitution plays itself out. We have to have independent states that have authority over their own lands. And so we have the one giant nation, we the people, big federal government, and then we have limited powers within the states. And so we then get into Section 4. So we're talking about expanding what that will look like. Section 4, the United States shall guarantee that to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion. And so this is kind of the promise of the federal government to the states, is that we're going to, if England comes after Georgia, it's not, oh man, Georgia, you're on your own. It's no, the states are united. And so this idea then again that there is kind of a mutual existence and a tension that is now still being built up between states' rights and the federal government. But the federal government will begin to oversee protection of people as a whole. And so we still will have state militias that will represent, and even today we have the National Guard. So Washington State has their National Guard, and those people who are in the National Guard actually report to the governor. The president cannot assign the National Guard member to go out and do something because they're the guard of that particular state. And then let's jump down to Article 5. And Elijah, you did a really good job of tying those all together, because they really are tied well together. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments, okay? So this is how now do we get to the idea of actual laws. Because the Constitution is really great to have structure and form, but if we don't have any real rule of law, I mean, what's the point of having legislatures, presidents, or Supreme Courts if there's not any laws to execute, to legislate, or to enforce, to adjudicate? And so this is laying out the how do we actually come to amendments. And again, we've talked about how when we pass laws, it's kind of a slow process, and it's designed to be that way. 2/3 of both houses, right? So Senate and the House of Representatives have to agree on an amendment. Now, looking at our modern culture, how hard would you say that is to get 2/3 agreement?
Pretty hard.
pretty. It's probably impossible right now. I mean, there's statistically about a 0% chance that any amendment would pass in our current system. And again, it's designed to be that way because when we're looking at constitutional rules that are set up, it has to be something that is so airtight as to represent we the people, all walks of life, all ages of life, all stages of life, and all colors, creeds, religions, beliefs. All of that stuff has to be covered. And again, Elijah, you said it really, I think, well. It's that, again, this idea or this form of government, it is meant to be representative of all the people. And so there's kind of, again, this built into the Constitution, this desire to kind of push away or push out our own selfish nature to want to rule and to push back towards there being a multitude of counsel. And so we have judiciaries, we have presidents, we have legislatures, but then we have state legislatures, we have governors. So there's a really big, robust system that's here. But as far as establishing the foundational principles on which the country is built, it is going to require a supermajority, 2/3 in order to get that to pass. And we'll see that come into play a little bit later on. Then we go to Article 6. All debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Congress shall be valid against the United States under this Constitution. And so again, whatever debts we incur in one administration, they stay with us through the next administration, they stay as things pass. We can't just have a group of legislators that say, yeah, we're going to take all of this debt, and the next people say, well, we didn't sign it, so we're out of there. We don't have to honor it. But the most important article of this actually comes with what's called the Supremacy Clause. What is the Supremacy Clause? Well, basically, what they've done here is said, okay, well, we've designed this Constitution to have really strong states and a really strong federal government. But what happens if the states have certain things that disagree with the federal government? Well, the Supremacy Clause says that the federal government takes priority over the states. And so, but those are only things that pertain specifically to constitutional arguments. And so, as we talk about the Supreme Court justice today, it's important for us to understand this, that there are things that the states can do, that if it's not written into the Constitution, the states have states' rights, and so the states can interact with anything that is not covered under the Constitution with kind of their own authority and their own power, and it's designed that way. But then there's this idea of constitutional law, right? And so when people go to court then to say maybe that this particular state is doing something unconstitutional, what they would have to prove is why is that unconstitutional? Where in the Constitution here? The articles and then into the amendments, is that affected? And so this will come into play when we talk about ultimately civil rights movement, and when we talk about women's suffrage and the right to vote. This is a hotly contested argument right now, is abortion, and the whole side of people that believe that this is about choice and it's about a woman's freedom to have autonomy over her own body. And there's a whole other side that's saying no. Those things that are growing in there are not merely a clump of cells, but they have the same rights under the Constitution. And as we'll get into that, we'll kind of see some of the arguments. And I would hazard to guess that we already have some opinions on those things, or at least loosely held opinions on those things. But again, we want to understand different sides and different perspectives and different arguments, because this is where we generally meet each other. Because in that case, we have two groups of people that are talking about two entirely different things, right? One group of people is talking about choice and saying choice is what's important. The other group is saying, well, no, it's not about choice. We're not talking about that. There's a bigger picture here. We're talking about life. And so we're going to have to analyze and dissect those things, because is it important for people to have choice over their own bodies? Yeah. But is there a question of whether or not that baby is a child or not? We have to define those. And the Constitution will help do that. Now, what we've seen historically is there's been some really, really bad decisions made from the Supreme Court by misinterpreting the Constitution. And this is where we get back to the idea of government being a representation of all people. Because ultimately the people have the authority then to push back against government, to re-elect people that will put in different laws, different rules, and that ultimately as Supreme Court justices transition out, we'll hopefully have people who are appointing Supreme Court justices in office who are thinking rightly. And yet we find that we're pretty fallible human beings. And so the Supremacy Clause will play a really important role in how ultimately things are decided from here on out. The federal government and the laws of the federal government have to be supreme, because the Constitution of the federal government is supreme over all other constitutions of the land. And again, the reason this article is put in there is so that when states come up, new states come up, they're not going to be able to put in their constitution things that would directly contradict the Constitution of the United States, right? If it's we the people, and if we're trying to get the public good, we don't want to put in a new state that's going to say, well, no, that was the old way of doing things. We're going to kind of do things a little bit differently. And then lastly, Article 7, which is the ratification, which is a bunch of names, and kind of finally deciding, this is what we've established, this is what we're this is what we're going with. And then again, the significance there of the signature can't be understated, is that these men at this time were literally putting their name on it. And so what does the name represent? It represents the honor and the respect of the position that they hold, and that they're going to be held to account to it. And so there is a kind of here the idea of a humble submission to the people, of saying, we have signed off on it, so we will take responsibility if this fails. And that can be a pretty daunting thing, right? It's no different than signing up for debt or something like that, right? So if you go to the bank and you ask for money to purchase whatever, you sign your name on there. What are you signing? What does your name represent? It represents your character. It represents who you are as a person, right? I mean, your name is important. So really quickly, how would you like, if you could pick, in a perfect world, one word where other people could define you, what would that word be? How would you want to be known?
Respectable.
Loyal.
Loyal? Okay. Kind.
Friendly.
Friendly. You all talked about noble things. How about you, Noah?
Well, words are too open to interpretation and
Uh-huh.
various meanings, so I'll probably just put my name.
Yeah, all right.
So if you know me well enough, then you know that Noah means me.
Noah.
All right. Right.
Are you here? Whoa.
Yeah. Well, notice how we all want to lean towards commendable things, right? I mean, if you're in your right mind, you don't think, I want to be known as being just mean, spiteful, hateful. Well, and again, and this is no small thing here, because this gets skipped over pretty oftentimes, historically speaking, that the whole ratification process, the whole signing our names to it, is really, really critical. And what Article 7 challenges us to do is really think mindfully about, are we really committed to this way of life? From a strictly American standpoint, right? Like thinking of the ideals of America, the question you would have to ask yourself is, are you committed to that way of life? The whole idea, again, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So these men who are signing this are putting their name on it. But then there has to be kind of, where it's proven is, again, with we the people. You see, ultimately they're doing what? They're representing the different states. And so their name is kind of the promise of the people. We see this biblically speaking when Jesus signs his name on the cross with his blood, with his life, with everything, right? As a ransom. The Bible says a ransom for many. He's put his life on the line so that we might enjoy the fruits of that. But that doesn't mean that we sit back and just go, he's done something great and fantastic for me, and I just get to sit there and rake it in. Well, no, we still have a responsibility to do what? To live out the ideals in which he lived and died for, and has, because of his sacrifice, has given us the Spirit, right? That we've been adopted as sons. Like this, that whole concept is on a much smaller scale baked into the idea of the Constitution and the idea of what it meant to be American. And again, we have to fight the urge, because a lot of what we see in modern day politics is not the ideal that our framers set out. There's not this kind of, patriotism and nationalism at all costs. They were of the mindset, the majority of them, that they were ordained, right? And that's a biblical word, that they were ordained and they were established by who? By God, their creator. And so as we understand that, faithful constitutional study or understanding is not in what do we know about the Constitution, what can I tell you about the articles, because all of they've done thus far is set up the broad strokes, right, the structure of the building. They put up the walls, we've put on the drywall, we've taped and textured, and it's a nice building, this idea of America, what it's going to be like. But now we have to, so to speak, dress the house, and then we have to live in it. Because ultimately, what's the point of anything if it's not lived out? The ideal of the Constitution is proven by its people. And so let me ask you this, and then we can move forward here. Does our current populace represent faithfully we the people when it comes to living out our constitutionally protected rights? What do you think? Is America doing a good job of living out the ideals that the framers put forward?
Nope.
Okay, why not?
I just don't think America's really doing anything to help that. I think America is very much focused on their own idea of what it should be and not listening to or having your own opinion on your side of, I don't know how to say that.
Okay. So no, because we have a bunch of individuals kind of have their own opinions and own thoughts and are trying to live out their own ideals. Okay, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Kayla. I think people are more going for what they want instead of what is said in the law, or like said in the Constitution for how it's supposed to go.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're at this point historically where we hear a lot of rhetoric, heated words that are thrown towards people instead of discussion and compromise, trying to seek a common place or a common ground. And it's important that we understand where we're at historically, because we've gotten off track. Now this will go into more opinion from my perspective. And I want you guys to wrestle with this a little bit, because there's certainly some pretty great things about America. In fact, America is still one of the few representation governments that really strives towards freedom. Now other countries have freedom, the way that we understand freedom. But yeah, we have a lot of difficulties and challenges, which we'll get into as we talk about each of the amendments. We have a bunch of fractions or groups that will take hardline stands, not for the sake of necessarily representing their constituents or representing what they believe to be true, but we have a lot of politicians now that will go with certain ideals because it will get them elected. So we'll see a lot of promises being made by politicians that I'll do this and I'll do that, and then when they get in, they don't. And what we have seen is a populace who now is not really engaged in understanding the Constitution, trying to live out the Constitution. In fact, I think if you questioned most adults, you would probably find that their knowledge of Constitution is pretty lacking. In fact, my generation was kind of one of the last ones to have civics in school, where we had to learn this stuff. It was forced upon us, and we had these kind of conversations. We've kind of created this vacuum where we have, in your generation now, a generation of TikTok and what other things do you kids do these days? Instagrams? Is that like where you find your grandma fast? No, that's not it. What other kind of stuff do you guys got? What's the new latest trends, right? Most kids your generation aren't thinking about constitutional law. Go back 100 years ago and 200 years ago. constitutional law would have been radically important for them because it was the underpinning of their life. They lived and died on the rights that were provided in this document. Just like when we meet on Tuesdays or we meet as a people, right? Our lives are dependent upon the truth that is held through God's word and how that's been established by Jesus being literally the Word made flesh, by the Father, his heart towards his people, right? By sending the Spirit to indwell us, that it is a process of engagement in those things. And so the real challenge here when we talk about the Constitution is not just, again, so we can learn a little bit about American history. It's about truly understanding the kinds of people that the Constitution was trying to build up and to foster us into becoming. And we have a choice in that, right? With like anything else in life, we can choose to, well, we can choose to blindly follow it, not really paying it any mind, but just going with it. We can choose to engage in it and wrestle with it and analyze it and allow us to change us and allow it to be a living document in a sense. We can reject it wholesale and say, no, this is not a perfect ideal at all. We can try to change it. Changing is probably the hardest thing because we have to have a supermajority to do it. And so my encouragement for you guys, again, is to not just look at this from an understanding of American history. Because what we saw here, and you pointed this out, Elijah, is there was a different form of government that was trying to be created. It was a government of consensus that wasn't just, popular feelings at the moment, but of a consensus of wisdom and understanding. And what we see with this group of people is that these were people who had a lot of authority and power, and they could have easily set up for themselves a form of government that would just empower them to have more and more and more stranglehold over the country. And yet what did they do? With that very power that was entrusted to them, they gave it back to the people. And how does the Constitution really come alive? Well, it comes alive in our ability to hold to the privileges that we have been given with our freedom, which means we get to enjoy a vast many things. And the danger in modern society is that we don't simply just kind of take it for granted. Thinking about world events right now, we might take for granted the fact that we're pretty free. Not as free as we should be, but we're pretty free compared to some other countries. And that could be other countries that are current country that's being oppressed by other countries, right? We have a war, an active war going on. But even more so than that, we have countries that don't have the medicine that they need, that don't have maybe the availability to equipment or food, things like that, right? So we're pretty blessed. The Constitution provides for that. But what is the goal? The end goal is it just to gain freedom for the sake of having freedom? Or is the goal in order to form a more perfect union? So how do we do that? How do we, knowing all of what we've learned now, how do we form a more perfect union?
We work together.
Yeah. But where does that start?
With ourselves.
With yourselves. Yeah. It starts with having to overcome our own personal likes and dislikes. Because I would hazard to guess, just in your age group, there are conflicts in personalities. I know certainly among siblings, right? There's difficulties or things we understand or don't understand about one another. And again, if we're not careful, what is our tendency, right? Like if I hurt Esther's feelings, and maybe I don't know that I did it or not, and Esther either gets really mad at me or she just shuts down, right? There's a dynamic there. But if we're wanting something that is, again, a more perfect union, right? Even in the context of this class or in our culture as a whole, it requires us to have to do what? To engage in that process. And so you guys have, again, the opportunity to demonstrate for the younger generation that's coming up what it looks like to have friendships and engagements and interactions. And what you guys are tasked with is the same things that adults are tasked with, right? Like, because I got to assume that there are people that you guys don't like or that you've come across that rub you the wrong way, that you struggle with. Does anyone struggle with anyone else here? Because I struggle with people a lot at times. I struggle with myself. I'm my own worst enemy. Sometimes I have tension with my wife or my kids. And I have to do what? I have to come back to this idea of what is the underpinning here? That God's desire for his sons is that we would represent him faithfully and well, not because we have to, but because it's our joy to do so. And even as we continue to learn, right, there's this idea of suffering or having obedience pushed upon us by the Father for our good, right? So we can learn something. Jesus learned obedience through the things he suffered. Jesus learned obedience through discipleship. And so again, the ideal here for us, properly understood, is how are you guys going to engage? Do I have permission to just make an observation? I'm really not trying to offend anyone here, because I like to observe people. And what I've noticed with your generation or with your group is it's a very silent group in our midst, oftentimes. And there's kind of this, the adults, your group, and then the little kids. And every once in a while I see some crossover. But it's a weird dynamic for me, because for the first time in my life, I've seen a generation that tends to be super relational, be super quiet. Now that could be a lot of things, right? A lot of new people to the group, a lot of different dynamics going on. And so I want to challenge you with something. And again, take this to the Lord, because this isn't thus saith the Lord. I could be wrong in this. I'm just making an observation. But I want to ask you, in what ways are you guys engaging to bring a more perfect union, right? To bring more wholeness to our community as people? Because the last time I checked, I don't think the design of it is that the adults are doing one thing and then there's the teenagers and then there's the little kids, right? We're still all together. Now there's a breaking out of different things, right? Women's meetings, men's meetings, there's different kind of establishment of things. But how do we, rubber meets the road, how do we, as a group of people, as individuals, make a more perfect union? So any thoughts on that or questions on that? Or am I completely wrong? Am I missing it? Am I just too old set in my ways and I'm just seeing things,
Well, your observation isn't wrong. And I guess the way for us to create a more perfect union in the context of our own group would be to be a light to others in our own way that we live life. And us as teenagers, and our dad talks to us about that, and we talk about it in other places. It is harder. It's not an excuse. That's not what I'm saying. It's
Sure.
just that is how we're supposed to do that. And I guess we're still learning how to represent our way of living.
I think it's kind of what you're trying to say too, is we're trying to come out of different things that we were used to as well.
Yeah.
That we were raised in as kids and stuff. It's just learning how to come out of that and into a new way.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that can be a little difficult because obviously it's not something we're used to. And I think another part of that is even overcoming yourself and your own desires and ways of thinking and things. And so I don't really understand why we're quiet. Maybe it's just because we don't have much to say or understanding in things, and so it just causes us to stand back a little bit and just be like quiet. And obviously we're catching things and we're learning how to do things, but there are some stuff that we still are learning and taking in, and so it's just, I guess, causes us to be quiet. Or
Yeah, you guys are in a difficult transition, right? Because you're second generation, right? So there's the generation that was before that kind of heard the call and did something and began to establish things, and now you're kind of coming up on that, and things have shifted and changed. Yeah, and I appreciate that honesty. I think that that's absolutely true. But I think that's all the more reason why. What helps us? What helped the framers? The framers didn't all agree. They didn't all come from the same way of life. They didn't all come from the same understanding of life. They didn't all have the same perspective on how things should be done. But what did they have in common? Again, they compromised. And compromise requires conversation and communication, right? And that's very foundational to what we'll continue to do here and what we'll do moving forward. Is that there has to be an opportunity for conversation and debate and discussion. And I would really challenge you guys towards this end. And again, I don't want to sit here as if this is a thus saith the Lord. It's just it's my observation. Is that I think really what would benefit all of us is to really reflect upon you. I think you, Elijah, you said, well, I don't want to make excuses. Well, I think that's a really good desire. But I think sometimes if we're not careful, what we'll do is we won't analyze what was the excuse you were going to make. Sometimes we just have to put that out there. Like, this is my thought on that. Now let's talk about that a little bit. Because I think one way that we would keep from living this ideal, and this happens in America a lot, is just being disengaged. I don't know how to engage with the Constitution, so I'm not even going to try. It doesn't even make sense to me. What's the point of it? Or, man, I feel overwhelmed. Or some people I feel like I'm young, or I haven't learned as much as they learned. But what does the Bible tell us? That let no one despise you because of your youth. I mean, the ultimate question you have to ask yourself has the Lord ordained you and put that on your heart to speak, right? Is that really coming from the Lord? Because we don't want to just have people throwing out whatever ideas that come to them, right? Hopefully we're all being harnessed by the Spirit of the Lord and we're obedient to that. But if so, then it requires engagement. But even within, and I'm sorry, this is kind of turning into something a little bit different than just Constitution, but I think it's important because I think it does have application. It's how do we engage? How do we engage with one another and create something, right? Because it's not just Emmanuel's and Tim's and John's responsibility, right? Ultimately, the Creator is God, and they will lead and they will guide. But it's our responsibility as people to understand the foundational teachings that have been laid, the framing that's going up, and then how do we live that out? We have to live that out in a way that engages, and it means, I think, Naomi, to your point, we might fall down every once in a while, and we might mess up. So what happens when we fall down? Are we around a group of people who will criticize one another, or do we reach out to try to build one another up? Because in real life scenarios, and when you study the history of the gentlemen that framed the Constitution, they didn't all get along. In fact, there were some pretty heated disagreements. But they had to learn to live with one another and challenge one another towards what? Towards a greater ideal. So I'll just leave that there. And so don't read too much into it. It's just an observation and a challenge that I think would be really well served. Because I tend to believe that you guys have a lot of insight and wisdom to give. And I believe that the Lord will stir that up, and I believe He has stirred that up in certain seasons and times, and that will, in what's fascinating to me for you guys is that you guys are kind of the linchpin. You're the hub, right? Because there's the generation that's before you, parents and elders, and then there's this generation that's coming up behind you. And so as you're moving into more maturity, right, you're kind of at the same time being pulled by the Spirit of God and hopefully by the example of the elders to move towards this ideal of life. But at the same time, you kind of in your wake, you have all of these young ones that are observing and following and watching and paying attention. Which I would hazard to guess some of the quietness is you guys are observing as well. You're probably like, okay, well, how are they engaging? What's going on here? All right. I see how that's done. So, all right. Supreme Court Justice nominee. What's her name again?
I forgot how to pronounce it.
How do you pronounce that name?
What is her name? Ketanji?
Just real quick.
Ketanji. So, what are some benefits? What are some good things about her? Ketanji Brown Jackson.
When I was reading about her, I feel like she had a lot of confidence in what she was doing. Even though there were people telling her maybe that she shouldn't or was going against her doing it, I think she had a lot of confidence and wisdom on law and stuff. So yeah, I forget where. Like, I know she grew up with her dad doing in law stuff. I think I forget exactly what he worked on, but she kind of grew up in a I don't know the word, but she grew up knowing the law and she really loved the law, so that helped her become.
I think she was a judge before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she's kind of went through different, she grew up and was around it, so surrounded, so she has experience. Yeah, she seems like somebody who has a level mind anyways, from what we can see, and that she's been through different appointments as far as a judge. Is there any criticisms that you guys could notice? What makes her a bad selection, or not as good as?
That could be different. Is obviously the color of her skin too could have something on it. Maybe I don't know. Because there was something that I read that said that Joe Biden had elected her because it was about time for someone like that to be elected again.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I don't know who's been elected before, but like a black woman as that was needed or something. I don't have much understanding of that, but.
So why? Let's talk about that. Yeah, because he came out specifically, directly, and said, "I'm going to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court." And so why could that be a negative? It doesn't have to be a negative, but why could that be a negative?
Because it could have not been because of her being a good person. It could have just been, it would look good for the economy or look good for the people.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe she wasn't the best pick, but she fit within that criteria, right? Because the only criteria we were limiting ourselves to was black woman, right? And so when you say woman, you're 52% of the population, right? So you just cut out 48% of the population. Now when you say a very specific skin color or whatever, that limits it even more, right? And so again, from the president's perspective, it is we need to have, again, this idea that she's going to represent, she's going to be, our Supreme Court is going to look more like people, right? And so, yeah, the real negative there could be the simple fact that do we have somebody who has really had all of the credentials, or was the best selection, or was she just one of the selections that fit, right? But in that same term, why could that be a good thing? So why could it be that, I mean, even honing in on it just being a black woman, why could that be a good thing?
Like just because of the color of her skin, or just a way that she could rule as a anyway.
Mm-hmm.
She has experience.
I think it's giving a chance to something that before like during even slavery and stuff, wasn't given a chance.
Yeah.
Proving that things have changed in that area of
Mm-hmm.
priority, I guess, in colored people's lives.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of the word, but just having them have an opportunity to be able to be in that place of
Yeah.
the government and stuff.
Well, we just talked about this, right? Like, this is a great opportunity maybe for, not just as significant for her or her generation, but the generation that's coming behind her. Now you have, and this is where we get into labels. Most time when we have these like first person to do this and first person to do that, the label is there not because, I mean, it's a great achievement, but really what it represents is those who are to follow. Yeah, and so the good part, and Esther, you had said this, is kind of the upbringing kind of creates this different diversity of thought or different ideals, right? Because a black woman who grew up around the law, around different experiences than maybe somebody vastly different. But also noticed she will be the first justice who is a public defender. Do you know what a public defender is? So those are lawyers that actually, like, if you didn't have the ability to pay for an attorney, a public defender would be appointed for you. So we've never had that in our history, and so that could be another good thing. Experience that she has is actually defending people who are poor enough that they couldn't afford lawyers and stuff like that. And so, yeah, the positives are diversity of mind and thought. She gives us a different perspective. It's a perspective we've never seen, but again, that can go two ways, right? And so the real challenge that we have here is kind of trying to analyze this from a perspective of looking at both sides of the argument here. Because I'm sure there are people who will be like, yeah, this is a hard no. And there are people that will say absolutely yes, automatically. There will be people that say, well, she's a black woman, so yep. But should we not, though, analyze that a little bit deeper, right? We should have Supreme Court justices have much more substance than the color of their skin and their gender. That's got to be important. I think that would be the argument. Now, any other thoughts on what makes her good or a challenge?
She wants to help the crime rate in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so coming again from that public defender background, crime and as far as that goes, did you analyze a little bit of her perspective on what will help with crime? No, so we got to do a little bit more digging there, right? You got some of that cursory knowledge, and we're going to have to wrap it up here. But again, kind of the point of this again is to get you guys to think critically. Now, show of hands, based on your limited information, and it was up to you, who would vote to appoint her to the Supreme Court? If you had the choice to say yes, we think she should go, or no, we think she shouldn't. So raise your hand if you think she's a yes.
I don't know.
I don't really know enough about her to really.
From what I know, yeah.
Yeah. Good. Is there anyone who would say no? Now here's again the challenge, and I took the no because I wanted to push back a little bit. I do think she's qualified in a lot of ways. My concerns would go back again to my own personal moral stance that abortion is wrong, and she would tend to be more pro-choice, and we'll get into having some of those discussions. And so I would be what would be criticized as a single issue voter. I will not vote for any politician who believes that abortion is right, thus carrying out that same thought. Now, we don't always have that luxury though, right? And so in a perfect world, if it came down to her versus other people that could get appointed, she's much more favorable to me than a lot of the other choices that could have been there. She's a little bit towards the more progressive, radical side of the Democratic Party. Justices are supposed to be impartial. Justices are increasingly becoming more partisan. But that being said, I think she represents a pretty good choice, all things considered. All right, so we'll wrap it up there. Next week, we will start on the amendments. And so, Kayla, you have not taught yet, so you're going to teach on the First Amendment. First Amendment is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so you'll take that up, as well as we will talk about the separation of church and state, which is not a part of the Constitution, but we hear that a lot, that there's a separation of church and state. Amendment 1 does not address that at all, and we'll talk about that. You probably touched on that a little bit last week. And then the argument that maybe we can make, the debate that we can have, is should we or should we not limit freedom of speech? Is there a place where speech should be limited? Should we have absolute total freedom to say whatever we feel whenever we want? Or from a legal standpoint, from a constitutional standpoint, should we refrain? All right, good job today. Elijah, great job. You had a really hard task. And to make that the correct assertion that really what was happening was kind of this collective idea of governing was very insightful. Most people would not catch that, and you did rightly catch that. So great job on that.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.